Morning, y'all. This is Ben. I am going to respond to a video today, and it's not like one of my normal responses. Anyway, the user is Trey Velocida, and bang goes a theory, evolution made simple. He's just talking about how mutations or errors in copying, like copying DNA, put my shoes on, can really cause changes over time. And then of course natural, he didn't really go into detail about it, but of course natural selection would select which of those changes are actually going to survive and to produce offspring. Now, what I want to do today is, you talk about evolution and then everyone's just like immediately thinks about the Bible and the evolution versus evolution. You look, it says top comment is the Tritringa, superb, stick your fingers in your ears and cover your eyes, creationists. That kind of thing. Or this guy, the rationalizer, says, preempting the creationist question, yeah, but who is holding the pen? And this, because they were these kinds of things. That's what everyone's thinking about. Anyway, the issue that I wanted to talk about was Genesis 1 and its interpretation, because this keeps coming up. So I thought I'll just make a video that's about Genesis 1 and its interpretation. So let's make some introductory comments. Basically, Genesis 1, what I'm going to argue is that it is a misinterpreted text, and that these so-called literal interpretations are actually quite liberal, and they do not let the text say what it wants to say for itself, and that we use all sorts of bad interpretation skills, and we're not letting the text speak for itself when it comes to Genesis. And I'm just gonna make a plea for this again. I'm sure it won't be the last time, but it just keeps coming up. Apparently for a lot of people, it's this Genesis disagrees with like a lot of science, and they say, how can this be? Science can't be wrong. I can't ignore science, therefore I ignore Genesis, or I disagree with Genesis. So the problem that when you interpret an ancient text like the Bible, what you're supposed to do is what's called exegesis, or historical exegesis, and you're supposed to figure out what it meant in the time frame and when it was written, and then you're supposed to figure out what it means for people today, and you're not supposed to get new meaning out of the text. You're not supposed to all of a sudden mean something new. And furthermore, if you understand the context of something, it can greatly change your interpretation of what was said. In other words, if I'm at the doctor's office and I'm coughing and I go no big deal, he coughed a little bit, maybe he's feeling a little bad, who knows. But if someone's in my way and I go it has a new meaning, because it means get out of my way, because of the context that it was said in. But as far as this issue of understanding what the story meant then, there's an example of this. There's a Greek word, in the New Testament was written in Greek, this the Second Testament in the Bible, and there's a Greek word called dunamos. It means powerful, or like power. And like we'll say, like the apostles were filled with dunamos from the Holy Spirit and so forth. And it's where the word dynamite comes from. The word dynamite based itself off this Greek word for power, and they said dynamite. It's like dunamos, it's like power. And people will do what bad exegesis and say, well, it says dunamos there. That means the power that the apostles had was like explosive, like dynamite. And they'll interpret the word dunamos in light of the word dynamite, but actually dynamite is named after dunamos, and it didn't have explosive power to them back then. They didn't use explosives like that, and they certainly didn't call them dynamite. And so that would be an example of lifting something from it that it didn't want to say. I guess another example, like the end of Romans, I think it says, Paul says, greet Tychicus with all my love. Well, we're not supposed to go and find Tychicus and greet him with Paul's love. That's understood that was written to the people back then, but it wasn't necessarily to us. It's not to us. It's not, and in fact, the beginning of the letter will say to the church in Rome, but as Christians, we believe that God oversaw that it was for us, but that we can't give it new meaning that it didn't have then. It can't all of a sudden mean something for us today that it didn't mean then, unless we're going to argue that somehow God secretly encoded a hidden message that the human author didn't know about. Now, Genesis 1 starts, and it does not start, there's no to so-and-so or anything like that. But if you were a Hebrew living in the time, it would be very obvious that it was written to you and written about something that you heard about a lot. This story, Genesis 1, takes the Babylonian creation myth and goes straight through it. And they would have all heard that Babylonian creation myth. They would have all been familiar with it, and they would have all, probably believed it. And what this story is doing is making the case that all those things you think are gods were actually created by God. So, and what it does is it uses puns. So, like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Again, waters would have been their sort of generic term for just chaotic mess. And in fact, the reason the word waters is there in these words like this is because of the linguistic, poetic puns that the text is using. So it uses words that translate into funny things like us. But there was a sea god, and like a chaotic sea god. And so what he's saying is, well, that's later. But what he's saying is, Marduk, the Babylonian god, okay, and is sort of a chaos god. Well, in like the primordial chaos god. He's saying God created that. And what he does is he takes a Hebrew word that sounds very similar, and he to Marduk, and he says, God made that, but he doesn't use the normal word that you would normally use. He uses an odd word that sounds odd to us, and the meaning of the word is odd, like waters, or the earth was without form and void, darkness was over the face of the deep, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The words they use are odd in their meaning, but they would have made a lot of sense in how they sounded because of the pun involved. So it's like if I say you can tune a piano but you can't tune a fish, it's all about the sound of the word. That's how puns work. And what he's doing is he's taking a reference to the Babylonian creation god, the primordial chaos god, and saying, this God, this original God was created, this original, thing was created by the one God. He says, let there be light. So again, he's using, I think it was Ea, the Babylonian creation god. He says, let there be light. And God saw that the light was good. Okay, so before we move any further, how does this line up with science? All this stuff about ancient gods. we must understand that this text was not written to tell you how the earth came to be in the major events scientifically that we would be concerned with, like when was earth first formed, and when did it become hospitable, and what was the early earth like, and what was the first life like. And these are questions that we ask today. But the question this text is trying to address is, should you or should you not worship the gods of other nations? And so what it does is it goes back and it takes actual events from the actual history of the earth, and it takes the things that people worshipped as gods from their perspective, and it says, it tells you when in the actual natural history God made that. Okay, so what this text is doing is, it's on the one hand it's taking the actual natural, totally scientific history of the earth. On the other hand, it's taking this pantheon of gods that ancient peoples worshipped, and it's going through the natural history, and when it gets to something they worshipped as a god, it says God made this one on next, and God made that one, and God made that one. So it's like do-do, do-do, and then it skips over do-do, do-do. So yeah, the earth when it was first formed was chaotic, but they believed in a chaos god. So he's saying the primordial chaos, God made the primordial chaos on the earth. Okay, they worship the light that lit up the earth. This doesn't mean that God created light. It's from the reference point of the earth, and from the reference point of what they worshipped and their concept of the light god on earth, and the lighting of the earth. Because to these ancient peoples, there was the light god and the night god, and day and night, and they worship those two gods. And he's saying it was next that God made that, and as scientifically that follows in, because the earth was chaotic, then it was the cloud cover could have should have seceded enough to let light get to the face of the ground. It says God let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters, formation of continents and a water cycle and this kind of thing, which they believe, the land gods and the sea gods and the sky gods and the rain gods. This is another big group of gods that they worshipped. And he's saying, next God made that. He doesn't necessarily say God made this and this and this and this and this, going straight through the scientific account. He takes the list of ancient gods and tells you where in the scientific account those were made. What the argument is doing is saying God made everything, and here's how he made these things you worship as gods, if you think made everything, here's when he made that one, and after that one he made that one, and after that one he made that one. He's saying they're not really gods, they're just natural forces made by the one God. So it said, and then it says, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered there called seas, and God saw it was good. It says, God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants. Okay, so we've skipped over like the Cambrian explosion. We've skipped over the first life in this, the first 80% of life on earth, that huge period where it was all single cell life. And we skipped over the Cambrian explosion where, animal life formed. And we're all the way to plants on land. Because they didn't worship any of that ancient stuff that would have long been dead. And the microbes and the entire age of microbes and the first microbes, they couldn't see that. They didn't worship, those people didn't worship that as gods. So he's not going to pick that out and say when God made that, because that would have been pointless and meaningless to those people. He just comes to the next thing. I mean, he would have had to explain what a microbe is and all this, but he comes to the next thing that they worshipped as God, and he does explain to some, what it is to some degree. He doesn't explain everything about it, but he says plants. God made the plants, and they knew about plants, and they worshiped plants. Plants were the foundation of their life, and so he says next God made plants. So we've skipped over all this to the next thing they worshipped In other words, it wasn't the next thing in their order of how important it was, but it was next in the actual scientific history of when it was created. It says, God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate them from the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons. Okay. In other words, lights in the expanse of the heavens. They worshipped lights in the sky. The sunlight. The powerful sunlight. And then the little stars. And the moon. They saw them up in the sky, and they worshiped what they saw, lights in the sky. And lights in the sky would have formed after plants. The sun and moon would have long existed, scientifically speaking, the sun and moon would have long existed, but the lights in the sky would not have formed until after plants affected the CO2 levels of our atmosphere. And so there's that distinction. In other words, when did the lights in the sky form? Let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven to separate the day from the night. When did the lights in the sky form? After plants. And they were clearly worshipped as gods, sun gods, moon gods, star gods, for every star, every constellation. And he's saying, what you worship as lights in the sky, I made the lights in the sky on this day. Now, they wouldn't have had a concept of super huge, powerful stars and orbiting celestial bodies that we, want to know about. We want to know, well, when did the moon form, and when did the sun form, and when did the rest of the cosmos form? But they would have, this is about the lights in the sky that they worshiped and saying, those would have been made after plants. Anyway. And God said, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the great expanse of the heaven. Okay. Now, living creatures is an odd word. It doesn't literally mean just something, an animal that's alive. Because we would say, well, life formed first in the seas, and it was swarming with them long before plants on the ground, and long before, the lights in the sky. But this is a problem with the language. This literally means animals that have the breath of life in them. There was an idea that those creatures had souls, mammal life. And it just lost in translation. But they worship, whales and dolphins, this kind of thing. This goes way back. And those would have been worshipped as gods. And he's saying next, God made those, and he made the birds. So this, whales I think would have come much later, but a similar time frame with birds. And so we've skipped dinosaurs, we've skipped a lot of stuff that they worshiped back then. A lot of stuff. But we found the things that they I'm sorry. We have not skipped the things that they worshipped. We've skipped a lot of stuff that actually lived. We've skipped, millions of years. But again, they didn't worship those things. But that we've skipped all the way to the next God that they worshipped and said, okay, this is when God made that. So again, we're taking anything they worshipped and saying this is when God made that. Primordial chaos. God made the primordial chaos. The earth when the earth was in its primordial chaos system. Light and night, day and night on the earth. God made that when he caused the chaos to settle enough and the clouds to settle enough. Water cycle, land, continent, seas, all that. We worship that. God made that next. Plants, God made that next. Lights in the sky, God made that next. Whales and birds, we worship that. God made that next. Okay, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. Livestock and creeping things, beasts of the earth according to their kinds. The word literally means like land carnivores, mammalian carnivores, and behemoth, we're behemoth and cows, that kind of thing. Powerful beast. And creeping things, they did worship rats. And they didn't have a word for rodents like we have. They would have had to say creeping things. So they had like living creatures, they had one word for that we have to translate 2 words, but creeping things is actually somewhere we have 1 word, but they, to translate literally, they literally are creeping things. So again, this is not all mammal life. This is the mammal life, like the cows and the wolves and the lions and the tigers and the bears that, ruled the, around, and the rats that went about. And these are things they worship, and he says, next God made those things. Alright, and so I mean, this text is making claims about literal, factual claims about science, but it's not making the claims that we think it makes. And that's kind of the issue. And then it puts man next, which scientifically man would have formed next. Now there's some issues with how man formed, but that's another issue. People are so caught up on the ones before this that I had to go over. Oh, then there's the time frame with the day thing. For starters, he doesn't even have a day, like all the way up until the earth allows clouds to separate enough to let light and day and night shine on the earth, and that would be the first day. So yeah. But again, as far as the word day, I mean, if you skip forward to like the next chapter, he actually refers to all these days as one day. There, I think it's in chapter 2, verse 4. Not every translation will be literal enough to just say it like that, but in reality, that's what it says. As far as with humans, there are some disagreements with science there, because the point is that there's a first man who's unique. Well, before we get to that, there's another issue. People feel like that Genesis 1 is all about, it doesn't have room for all the violence and destruction that went on before humans came, and it seems to say, like he says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, this is the humans, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fishes of the sea and the birds of the heavens, every living thing that moves on the earth. 29, and God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. The important thing to keep in mind here is that this thing forms, and originally it's very chaotic, and it slowly becomes less chaotic, and eventually God brings more order, more order. And it's very interesting with the whales. They do bring order to the seas. Dolphins do, and whales, they are the boss people, of the seas, and that kind of thing. And birds bring sort of an order to the skies. It's kind of their domain. So there is a sense there. Let's see. As far as with humans, the issue is that there's these first 2 humans, and they're like this unique group that multiplies and spreads out, and so that would seem, like, well, that, there's no, how do we interpret that? Well, it is important to keep in mind that let's see, God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Again, this would not necessarily be, this would be the formation of a human that's truly human, but any hominid, sort of species, the best way you could make this agree with science, even if you're trying to make it agree with science and you're not necessarily letting it say what it wants, the best this allows you is that hominid species existed, but all of a sudden a truly human one that was biologically the same but had some different capacity was entered into the mix and was a special creation, and then the first female was made from that one, and that those two beings, you know, changed everything because God made them able to understand that you know, this isn't necessarily that there were you know, there could have been humans that were biologically the same but did not have the conceptual and behavioral identity that these first two would have had. Now, that is something that science needs to work on proving or disproving. This was a very long video, and we could go on forever, but we'll stop there. I hope this means something to someone or makes sense to somebody. If it does make sense to you, please let me know. If it doesn't, just let me know that too. I know people get so mad that I would say Genesis says things that agree with science. They say I'm being liberal or I'm interpreting it however I want. And what I'm trying to do is make the case that if you look at this text for what it says, it's not saying what we think it says, but what it does wind up saying is actually not so far from science. Thanks, bye.